So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end. As per YershiYau the prophet, we find a layer of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid away for many centuries. So then, as we study then these documents, we find ourselves then understanding what the Messiah did when he came and completed the spring feast. Let's then understand, firstly, the importance of the prophet YershiYau. The world today is wishing for the new system, and as we can understand, reading from Daniel the prophet, we find Daniel firstly as a politician, a tradesperson, a very important individual, where he was then involved with the king of his time. And he worked under many kings, and his objective was bringing trade for the kingdom, besides being a prophet. Let's understand this perfectly, because we must understand the importance of the holy writings, the holy Hebrew words, and the words are specific. They are not interchangeable. From the Creator, He has a specific words for specific meanings. Understandably, the five senses that we have then determines the way of reading the holy instructions. Let's understand then Daniel the 11th chapter. We find ourselves then during the time of the restoration period, and the most important time we are then yet awaiting for next year, where then Mr. Xi from China, the kingdom of the East, makes a deal with the kingdom of the South, precisely then in Congo. As we understand, Congo is a very important area of Africa, because YershiYau the prophet told very clearly in chapter 1:8 of YershiYau, he mentions woe to the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. He was speaking of Congo because of its riches regarding minerals and regarding areas of the place where you find coltan. It's a mineral that you can then obviously make miniaturization of components, electronic components for space, for electronics such as computers, telephones, and many other devices. These are extremely important. Let's then understand firstly what the holy instructions are saying, because we must have for ourselves a road or map, so then we can become acquainted and not being ignorant of the devices of the enemy. Let's try then decipher the meaning of the 11th chapter. Then we find ourselves studying Leviticus the 23rd chapter, where you find the feasts or Moadims. If we can understand this in English, if you truly like plural words in English, but truly Moadim is plural, so you can't use S at the end of Moadim. Moad then is singular. We are awaiting then for the autumn feast. Precisely then the 11th chapter gives us 11th chapter, and then verse 4 is where precisely we are at. What's going on then in Sudan? Sudan is a place where is the land of Cush. Cush is the place where Yohanan was at because of the persecution after the ascension of the Messiah, and roughly 100 years later he found himself far away south, and he was then in Sudan, in the northern side, on the land of Cush. Precisely then YershiYau the prophet mentioned precisely where Yohanan was at then later, after the 1,000 years of the Messiah, after the 1,000 years of Nahashatan, then the restoration period would start precisely where Yohanan was at. Not only this, but you find in South Sudan going through a very hard time. People are being slaughtered by the hundreds, and then we have to understand what the instructions are teaching us, because at the moment the strong man of Africa is Mr. Kabila. He is the strong man in Africa, and he must step up to his position. We find ourselves studying what the prophet YershiYau has said. Woe to the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. The place is Congo. Let's establish then the understanding of the northern kingdom, the leader of the northern kingdom, and the leader of the eastern kingdom. You find then respectively, Mr. Putin is then the strong man of the northern kingdom, Mr. Xi the strong man of the eastern kingdom, and then lacks the third, Africa. The strong man of Africa is Mr. Kabila, liking it or not, because the place where then YershiYau the prophet has mentioned is the place where the leader of Africa comes from. So then, South Sudan, we find ourselves then reading Daniel the 11th chapter. We know precisely then from YershiYau chapter 1:8 the place where tabernacling is going to be at. If you read the content and the context of the 11th chapter, the time of the restoration period, you find then a relationship of tabernacling in Congo. There is a relationship. Why? Because when you read the covenant later, and then when you read the deceitful covenant at the same time, you understand then the link of Sudan and Congo. At the moment, Mr. Kabila must become influential in the entire continent of Africa, including Sudan. The objective is helping, firstly, tabernacling being established, and second, being a mediator of what's going on in South Sudan. He must step up to his objective. He has no choice. The situation is going to be so desperate, he will become very concerned with it. As kings in the Old Testament, as we may say, there is no Old Testament, there is the instructions. But if you can understand from Old Testament, the Creator always, at times, in certain areas, gave very specific dreams regarding situations. Always, because the Creator is always continuing. When He is involved, He is always continuing. When we are involved with the Creator, then is limited on our side. Let's then understand the importance of Mr. Kabila in South Sudan. He must step up and make amendments and get the place organized and deals being made, because China is coming down to Congo next year to make a deal. Mr. Kabila must include South Sudan in order to make peace with it. The only place must have war is Congo. At the moment, you find then the Messiah is speaking in YershiYau, the 24th chapter, where you find then the Messiah himself speaking, you will hear of war, singular, and rumors of wars. The only war we can find is woe to the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. You find these in YershiYau, certain sections of it, and you find precisely then in Daniel. He dedicated his life mostly for the Gentile world, though he knew tabernacling, because he had obviously copies of the holy instructions of YershiYau and Yirmiyahu. He had those portions of the Holy Instructions, because the Creator always provides what is important for His objectives. So then, with this in mind, we have then the establishment of Galah, what is coming in the future. The Messiah himself spoke, and the Gentile Luke, chapter 1:7, has a very important section regarding then people being deceived because of the mundane, day-to-day, without the holy instructions. Those people are going to be caught unawares and burned at the end. And he gave a couple of examples: the time of Noah and the time of Lot. We must be acquainted with the holy instructions. YershiYau has said in the Torah, you will find then those understandings, the shadow prophetic events, because the Creator is continuing. These then we find tabernacling. So then, let's find what's going on then with Mr. Putin also, because he is then the strong man of the Northern Kingdom. As we have heard the news lately, Mr. Kalishnikov has died at 94 years old. He was an icon of the Northern Kingdom, and there is also a hole left in the country. However, the Holy Instructions provides us with understanding, with a secondary understanding of what should be done if we are smart. What is the objective? You find the 11th chapter then regarding the kingdom of the north, kingdom of the east, and the kingdom of the south. The kingdom of the south, the strong man is Mr. Kabila. There is no other person. You find at the moment he is the strong man of Africa, and he must step up and do what he must do. So then, let's try to understand then the combat, what goes on then in the future, because there is a very important section regarding then the writings of YershiYau. You find certain sections regarding then the ships of Tarshish, and you find also in the 11th chapter of Daniel the ships of Kittim. Those understandings are prior of the ending of the 1,000 years of the Messiah. Obviously, if you read, you understand. Read from the Israelic lineage and not the Greco-Roman, obviously. Let's try to understand then what YershiYau the prophet has mentioned regarding then Leviathan, as so named then the marine monster. There is no marine monster. What YershiYau was explaining was the understanding of the ship underwater. We find ourselves then understanding, because when you read the 27th chapter, you are reading in the time of the restoration period and the prelude of the Great War. The content is submarine. When you understand then Leviathan, you understand a ship under the water. When YershiYau the prophet was then prophesying these prophecies during his time, can you imagine his friends hearing from him ships under the water? What could they have, for God's name, what were they thinking? YershiYau then was crazy. How can you find a ship under the water? These and many other real understandings of the future led to his sawing in half. So, let's read then the 27th chapter, because when you begin to read, you find in that day what he is explaining. The autumn feast, localized then in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd through the 44th verse. You find then the autumn feast precisely 490 days. As is the spring feast, half of the Torah, half of the prophets, was then 490. What do you think the other half is? 490 days. These 490 days were experienced and trained at the end of the first 1,000 years of the Messiah, then in 6009 or 1009, when the Muslims invaded Jerusalem and they destroyed the tomb from where the Messiah came from. It was the first time. When you read then YershiYau the prophet, the 27th chapter, it's not a marine monster, it is submarine. It is the understanding of the ship under the water. Then you combine these with the ships of Kitin in 11th chapter of Daniel. Then you find both of them working for then her as lust. A section of it related with war, ships of war, and the anger. The anger understanding is the furious understanding of war under the water. You are speaking of a submarine. Submarine warfare combined with ships above the water. Because the 27th chapter, the section of it related with the restoration period and then leading towards the autumn feast. So you are not reading a Leviathan, then the beast or some sort of monster, because the Creator does not create monsters. Though He did create big beasts in terms of animals. But what is the content of the 27th chapter? What is the content? Are we studying beasts? Are we studying lizards? Studying serpents, or understanding what they signify? We are studying of the lust of the ships and the lust of the war, both of them working together for the lust of her, then the lady in Galah. And the nations were drunk because of her. The understanding then becomes much clearer, doesn't it? So then, what do we find as far as the Northern Kingdom? The Northern Kingdom is very specific. As we found, then, Mr. Kalishnikov has died. You find the 11th chapter of Daniel, then verse 1-4, explaining then the Northern Kingdom coming later with much equipment. This means the Northern Kingdom must be on top, militarily speaking. However, we find ourselves firstly protecting trade via China and the unification of the socialist system, where you find the Gentile Netzer. Those are the gatherings of the socialists for the protection of trade via computer. So then we can layer this together and understand the 12th chapter of Daniel. It is simple. However, the Northern Kingdom has a hole. Hole means there is a place where it's lacking. And the lacking part of it is very simple understanding. The Soviets must come up with the best defense system. Defense system. Not because of the military, because of what the nations are searching for. Many nations have arms for sale. Not so many nations, they have a system to protect from these. Though there is the Iron Dome, as we are familiar with, but the Soviets must be on top. As we read from the 11th chapter of Daniel and verse 1-4, you'll find later then the Northern Kingdom coming with much equipment. This means they are in charge. So then, as many nations are purchasing equipment, purchasing tanks, purchasing helicopters, purchasing aircrafts, purchasing arms, what can you understand of the Northern Kingdom? Speaks of protection. The best protection in the world. And the existing arms race yet continuing for the purposes of protection. The Northern Kingdom must be on top. So then, we find these understandings very clear. You can read the 11th chapter from the Israelic lineage. You find yourself, the Creator will help you. Because it's not from a person only that you're going to get the entire understanding. You have to practice yourself. You have to read, you have to speak, you have to hear yourself, and you have to understand your own layers, not because of your own making, but because of the layerings of them. When you read the layers, you must position them precisely, so then the machine of Ezekiel, the 1st chapter, you begin to understand the synchronisms. YershiYau the prophet is the reference. YershiYau the prophet was the center of the understanding of the entire Torah and the entire instructions. Liking it or not, you find every Megillah of the holy instructions somehow, some way related with YershiYau. Then from YershiYau on top comes the machine and the Creator himself in the very center. And we humble ourselves before the mighty understanding of the layers of the Torah and the prophets, so then we can live. At the moment, we are expecting next year China making a deal with Congo. Mr. Kabila is the strong man of Africa, liking it or not, and must act as such. We understand Mr. Xi is leading China, and Mr. Putin is leading then the Northern Kingdom, but Africa is lacking leadership, and the leadership is in Congo. Read the holy instructions. Be wise, be humble. Understand then the holy instructions, the holy layers, and the Creator will give understanding. So then, we find ourselves then making a link with trade and war. We understand then the ships of Galah, the 8th chapter, as merchants, and we understand the war going on at the same time, protecting the lust of her. 27th chapter of YershiYau gives you the understanding of it. YershiYau did not know what a submarine was, but he knew that there was a ship underwater. But how can a ship underwater can have anger? You have to understand the spiritual understanding of this prophecy combined with a literal machine, at the same time a ship that goes under the water. The only place he could ever find was Leviathan, because it's mixed with anger, vengeance, autumn, feast, and lust, and trade. When you speak of vineyard, you are speaking then of obviously juice, grape juice. But when you mix anger with the juice, it is fermented. What do you understand of Galah and her then on top of the beast, then drinking? Then you understand Leviathan means the submarine warfare. From then on, we begin then our quest understanding then the influences and most importantly the proper events, step-by-step events until next year, where then we move then 11:5. But then Mr. Putin, as the strong man of the Northern Kingdom, must be militarily on top. He has no choice. Neither do we. The Southern Kingdom is Mr. Kabila, must organize then Africa except Congo, then later comes down then the Northern Kingdom and crushes the rebels, and then brings understanding and trade then in the south. The rest of the world should be at peace, because the Messiah said very precisely what YershiYau had spoken. You will hear of war, and then rumors of wars. These are the proper interpretations, because they are layered properly. Much more coming up, because then I'm going to study precisely then how the war is going to take place and the events. So then the machine of Ezekiel can be properly placed, so then the cogs and gears, then when they set, they begin the motion. And it starts next year when China makes a deal with Congo. Now you have to try yourself to read and layer them properly. So then you are not dependent from other people. Always have to speak in your ears because you are lazy. You do not like to read the whole instruction, but then you suck from others and always hungry for more, but always lazy to read. So then stay tuned because much more coming up.